Welcome to In Conversation. I'm your host, Steve Iverson. Our guest today is Dan Strollo, the Executive Director of In Control. It's a local nonprofit organization that provides automotive crash prevention training. Since 2003, they provided the training to over 30,000 students, and we'll hear more today from Dan about what the training includes and how it helps people to drive more safely. So thank you for coming on, Dan.
Hey, Steve. Thank you for inviting me.
No, you bet. I heard about this a little while ago. I heard about your program. I heard about the school. I frankly had never heard about anything quite like it before. How did it get started?
So I did not invent this. In fact, it's been going on in European countries for decades.
Okay.
I got involved a little more than a decade ago now, where having 4 kids, as we've talked about, and I take this opportunity to apologize to the LexMedia community for my involvement in overcrowding of our schools, but having that many kids and looking at how many kids were dying on the roads, it kind of surprised me. And I got introduced to this myself as a marketing consultant to make some recommendations, and then they asked me if I wanted to take it over. So we're using a lot of the training that goes on in these European countries, and what folks don't always realize is the United States, way back in the 70s, was the safest place in the world to drive. We had the lowest death rate per capita compared to anybody else. Today, we're generally around 40th place. So these countries that have kind of focused differently on the way they educate their drivers enjoy far fewer crashes. So this is a big piece of that.
It's more that they've gotten better rather than we've gotten worse.
So the technology that we put in vehicles has actually helped reduce deaths. And so actually the death rate now is pretty close to what it was back then, but we have far more crashes and people just aren't as injured the way they were previously. But at the end of the day, these other countries that, if you go to get your license in Germany, for example, it's a 1-hour road test. And you're going to go on city streets, highways, you're going to go out to an abandoned space and prove that you can put the car into a skid and then regain control. And then, a driving test here in Massachusetts is not going to be more than 5 minutes, oftentimes less. And that's really just the way they've built the regulations around it. It's nothing wrong with the driving schools are doing their role, and just the regulations around it is you're going to spend this amount of time and prove that you are reasonably safe. But then those kids go off, and somewhere in the neighborhood of 60 to 70% of kids crash in the first 2 years after they get their license. So that's not a statistics I'm super comfortable with. I think that's way too many people getting injured. And ultimately, this became something like, wow, I can't believe we're not doing more of this. So we bring it to families, to teens, to companies, and try to get them to take advantage of the program. And in addition to the training that we do a lot of community engagement. Us talking here today, or I'll come to PTO groups or other civic organizations and try to talk to them about road safety and just educate them, as well as partnerships we have with the state where we do things with the Boston Globe and different TV stations to try to present safe driving concepts.
Okay. So what kind of classes do you offer, and what actually happens in them?
So our most common class, we call it Crash Prevention 101. That's what most people participate in. When we work with different companies, we train a lot of police officers, we train ambulance companies. The type of training they get is different, but it all starts with the same core CP 101 concept. We need you to understand the basics before you go further. And it's hands-on. It's closed course. We're doing this, currently we're up in the old North Andover Lucent Technologies plant space. It recently got purchased by Amazon, so we're still there, but we're looking for places to maybe move to. In South Weymouth, it's the old Naval Air Station there, so we use one of the runways. Just these big open spaces where people can make mistakes and learn from them. And it's a series of different drills. We use a lot of drama. We're trying to get people's attention. So the first drill we do is a highway speed panic stop. So we're having them travel between 50 and 60 miles an hour. And this is whether you're a 15-year-old kid out in New Hampshire. We've had a 94-year-old graduate, and really all ages in between. You got to slam on the brakes and get that car to aggressively stop. And we set up a wall of cones and tell you to stop before that wall of cones, and we don't let you hit the brake until a certain space. And what's really interesting is in that drill, a large percentage of the time, people slam on the brakes, the car dives down, and they freak out. The seatbelt locked up, there's noises they've never heard before, the steering wheel's vibrating, and they take their foot off the brake.
Oh,
Which is really counterproductive when I told you to stop as fast as you can.
Yeah.
And they hit this wall of cones we've set up in front of them. We pick the cones back up, we repeat the drill. 100% of the time, everybody stops without a problem. And that's really kind of indicative of the type of thing we're trying to do. We're trying to build some muscle memory, trying to give you that instinctual reaction. And frankly, chisel away at invincibility, particularly with younger drivers. You know, that whole frontal lobe development, they're risk takers. We want them to realize that, you know, they're not Superman or Superwoman. There's things that are outside of their control if they push the boundaries on how that vehicle can behave.
sure. I imagine there's a lot to be said for actually trying these things rather than just being told about them in a classroom.
That's the idea. Experiential learning is really, you know, much more beneficial in the grand scheme. And it's not to say there's a lot of other things. There's simulators out there. They can do some amazing things. I'm kind of a technology geek myself. But the reality is you can't experience that G-force. You know, to feel that seatbelt lock up on you. We haven't come up with a way to mimic that yet in an online type environment. So feeling it in the real world is huge. And that's where we see a difference. I mean, I don't go a week or two without somebody sending me an email about how they avoided a crash. Simply thinking of that particular drill is one of the examples. And all that drama, you know, just going through, there's a variety of different drills that we'll put people through. And at each one, there's a moment where they kind of can say to themselves, wow, I didn't realize. And that's why I always try to encourage parents to go with their kids. They're not good drivers either. Spend 5 minutes in the center of Lexington, and you'll see there really aren't that many people who know how to drive a car.
Right.
You know, there's so much that they're doing wrong, but they think they're right. And if, again, we can chisel away at that whole invincibility piece of it, it makes a big difference.
What you said caught my attention because I think on a very simple level, what you see is that people think that they know the laws and they don't anymore, or they get some things wrong after years after they've actually gotten their license. People seem to still get very confused about what's supposed to happen in Rotarys, for instance.
So Rotarys actually are starting to become more popular in the United States because they're ultimately safer. If you can avoid having to stop and having somebody potentially rear end you or all the different aspects of that interaction. But if you don't know to, you know, allow the person who's already in the rotary to have the right of way before you get in behind them and you just cut them, it starts to lead to bigger problems. And I've participated in a few studies in different, even just some TV shows specifically pointing out how ridiculous some of the rotaries are in Massachusetts. And it all boils down to us not knowing what we're doing. You know, there's a lot of things that people think are the right way to approach things. We talked before about ABS brakes.
Right.
You know, ABS brakes are an amazing feature to have on a vehicle. I encourage everybody to drive a vehicle. Most of the cars since 2010 have it, but prior to that, you could still get it without it.
Right.
And, you know, to save money, or the young driver in the family might have an older car, if there's nothing else, please get ABS brakes for them, because it means you can just push that pedal as hard as you want to, and it'll pulsate the brakes for you. And that the big benefit to that isn't that you stop any faster. It's that if you're heading for something and you have to slam on the brakes to try to avoid it, you can still steer because your wheels don't lock up. You're still able to steer around it. But you've got people out there today who are driving cars with ABS brakes that learned to pump the brakes, and they're doing the wrong thing. And it takes substantially longer to stop the car. It can be dangerous. You know, ultimately, you can confuse the brake system and it's not performing the way you want it to. And there's a lot of technology like that in cars. I mean, I think technology is a great thing. And, you know, I'll be the first one to enjoy my Uber ride home or my, you know, Google car ride home with somebody not driving me and just getting to my destination without having to worry about things. So, you know, I'm a control freak, but there's going to be some times where I'll benefit from that. But it's not ready for prime time. You know, it doesn't do everything that, you know, the consumer really needs it to do just yet. And so there's cars that have half the features built into them. So maybe you think, oh, it's okay for me to text and drive because my car supposedly will stop. Well, what if it doesn't? What if you hit that pedestrian? Or what if you rear end somebody and hurt yourself and them? It's not a good thing. And it's unfortunate that we're kind of living through this time now where we're half in and half out of that world.
So you're teaching things in the classes like emergency braking and stopping, avoiding hazards, I would imagine. Anything else that you cover?
So one of the first things we do is we teach you that panic stop. And it's probably a good time for me to mention we use our cars. We go through tires every 7 days.
Okay.
You don't necessarily want to do this to your car. We do have tailored programs where we let people use their own vehicle. There's some winter driving programs when Mother Nature cooperates where they're able to drive their own vehicle. But at the end of the day, the physics behind what we're doing, we train National Grid drivers in these big tractor trailers, fire engine operators, different vehicles. This physics is, the concept is the same with the way currently we use the Honda Accords, and they're going to behave very similarly. One of the things, once you've learned how to do a panic stop, is we want to introduce you to why you shouldn't be texting and driving, or why you should stay engaged behind the wheel. I always try to refer to it as we want you to drive engaged as opposed to being distracted.
Sure.
And there's plenty of distractions. Again, talking about technology, my sweet 77 Mercury Monarch that I bought when I was 16 had, a bunch of things they called idiot lights and a speedometer, and that was it.
And a radio.
And it might have had a radio. I don't know if it even
Might
worked.
have, right.
But, today, your dashboard, there's cars you can update Facebook. The weather's constantly being thrown. It's very distracting. And that's just that. And then you introduce a phone and all these other things. So we have some drills around how easy it is to be distracted. And one of the points I'd encourage, to be made here in this environment is, we've got this new hands-free law coming in. And it's just in the next couple of weeks as we record this. And the idea is, to be frank, you shouldn't even use your phone hands-free. The part of your brain that is focusing on that conversation you're having with somebody is the same part of your brain that needs to be helping you drive safely, to help you stay engaged, to help you see that person stepping off the curb 2 blocks down and all these different things so you can be aware of it. But beyond all that, they put this legislation in place because people are doing so much texting behind the wheel, not just young people. This is drivers of all ages. It's become a huge problem. And there's those that violate that law already just driving around. And hopefully this new law, by saying you can't even touch your phone while you're operating the vehicle, will enable police officers to write tickets and stop more of it. But I'm never surprised as again, you can see right in the center of Lexington, there are people who, your neighbor, your friend, you're the most morally sound amongst us. When they stop and they get to that red light, they pick their phone up because they heard the chime, or they are excited to see what's going on Facebook, and they know they've got a 30-second, delay here. But the reality is, and I always try to describe it, Knight Rider, go back to I think that was probably the 80s or 70s when that show was on.
Yeah.
You are driving around and you have this full field of vision and you are, engaged in driving. And then as soon as you pick up that phone, you lose situational awareness. And you go from this big scanning back and forth of Knight Rider to you're just like this. And so ultimately when that light turns green, you start driving forward, and it takes a while before you're back to scanning the road the same way. But what we're finding is a lot more bicyclists, a lot more pedestrians are getting hit because you'll go 3 blocks down the road and you didn't see that person just about to step off the curb because you were so focused, you had tunnel vision. And so they say it takes about 27 seconds to regain full situational awareness. So just think about it. Would you want blinders on for the first, 25 seconds of you driving down the road? So these are things that we're seeing as technologies, being introduced to us everywhere in our lives. Behind the wheel is not a place we want you to do it. So we have some drills, I won't give away all the ways we approach it, but we have some drills that are focused on experiencing that loss of control because you weren't engaged in driving. And, another place that I see here, so I've got 2 kids at the high school right now, and I have an occasion to drive them to or from school. And I've done this project through some grants in the past with other communities. You'd be blown away by how many kids do not wear their seatbelt. Now, Massachusetts was actually one of the lowest in the country. New Hampshire's generally a little bit behind us, but we've been as good as maybe 42nd place, but generally we're like 47th, 48th place in the country for seatbelt use.
I didn't know that.
And
I always thought, I guess wrongly, that younger people mostly did wear their seatbelts because they grew up with it. I have to remind myself sometimes to put it on because I'm an older person. People didn't always wear them when I was learning to drive.
Correct, yeah. And so I do think there are still some parents who don't wear them, so maybe those kids aren't wearing them because they didn't see their parents wear them. But what we're finding is they're really good about wearing their seatbelts with their parents, and then they get their license, and that invincibility thing kicks in again. And so we'll ask them, like, why don't you wear your seatbelt? And it's a pretty universal response. They don't plan to crash. And just think about it from the teenage mind, and I'm not taking anything away from, we have some brilliant teenagers in this town.
Yep.
But if you've been told your whole life, wear your seatbelt so you don't get hurt in a crash, you may, in fact, figure, you're invincible, that frontal lobe development thing again. I don't plan to crash, so what do I need the seatbelt for? in our second drill that we do with everybody, we do a slalom. We're going in and out of cones, and we have our instructors drive it first, and that's how all the drills work. We demonstrate it, then we have the student drive it, and then we have a recap in the classroom. We go back out and go to the next drill. When our instructor's going through that slalom, they're going 5 to 10 miles an hour faster than the student could ever go. And that car is bouncing around pretty good. And we'll say to them when we're done, like, hey, where would you be sitting if you didn't have your seatbelt on? And they're kind of laughing. They're like, oh, I'd be in the front seat. I'd be in the back seat. I'd be squished up against them. That's why we want you to wear the seatbelt. It's not as much, we want you to get hurt, protected if there's a crash, but we want you to stay behind the wheel. And you can almost see light bulbs go off. In communities where we've just gone and driven with kids, we hear from the police that they're seeing the seatbelt use go through the roof because they just finally get it. They connected the dots. And that's not something we talk about. The mantra is wear your seatbelt so you don't get hurt. But if you never expect to get hurt, it almost makes sense.
So they start to, the light starts to go off about wearing the seatbelt because they're riding in a car doing things that actually make them sort of bounce around a bit.
And they had the experience of, if I didn't have that seatbelt on and I was behind the wheel, I don't know if I could stay behind the wheel.
Gotcha.
And again, from a safety perspective, I want your feet in a particular place. I want that left foot on what's called the dead pedal side of so that you can use that leverage. But if you're, driving like this with no seatbelt on, you got the stereo turned all up, it becomes a lot more difficult to keep yourself in position behind the wheel.
So you're teaching, you're providing these classes, it sounds like, to a lot of younger people who are learning how to drive. But I noticed at your website that you also teach classes aimed at other groups.
Yeah.
Commercial drivers, police officers, seniors. How do you tailor what you do for those other groups?
So our passion as a 501c3 is to work with teens. They have the highest crash rate. I mean, if you look at how many kids we lose, it used to be 15 to 18 was the highest loss. Now it's actually 19 to 25 because kids are putting off getting their license a little older with Uber and technology and all that sort of stuff. But it's still, it's not necessarily you're 25, so now we should go out as a society and have all the kids wait until they're 25 to get their license. There's still an experience piece of this. And so that's our passion. But we see a lot of companies sending their employees. There's a lot of grants they can take advantage of that we actually started walking people through. So we tell people to contact us and we can introduce them to some grants. And we'll tailor it, as I mentioned, for law enforcement. There's some unique things that we want them to learn because of the way the vehicle will behave. We'll have companies contact us about specific issues. Like, unfortunately, there was a tragedy a couple weeks ago with the Holy Cross coach drove a van and a woman was killed. We do a lot of training for independent schools. So we'll go to a school and take the coaches and the faculty who might take kids on field trips. And, these are young people teaching often, and we'll walk out to this van and they haven't driven anywhere near the number of hours where I would consider them an experienced driver, but they're tossing them the keys to a 15 passenger van and telling them to drive to a soccer game that's 5 towns away. And sometimes they don't know the technology. These buses have some pretty unique things to make sure doors are unlocked for safety reasons if there's a crash. They don't understand the braking. This is a vehicle that's going to take a lot longer to stop.
Sure.
Particularly when you add the students to it.
Sure.
And we'll show them the difference in that. And then just simple things like maneuvering it in small spaces. So there's a lot of opportunity. And at the end of the day, most of the training we do is pretty consistent. Rear end collisions. Massachusetts happens to be, that's our number one crash type. We used to be number one in the country for rear end collisions. And frankly, we have one of the worst. If you look at, when they're always talking about the cities, like Boston will be 48th and Worcester might be 49th, for the worst crash rates. And we don't have the highest death rates only because you can only go so fast with all the traffic we have. And we have these amazing hospitals. But we're crashing left and right. The loss of productivity and the expense. And just, again, people are hurt. You might not die, but you may never be able to play that sport you love so much. Or you might not be able to have the career that you were hoping to have. That's a big deal to me.
Where do your instructors learn how to teach what they teach?
So almost all, there's a few folks in law enforcement that we have now that instruct for us, but most of them are race car drivers. Oh. And we don't necessarily promote, we're not there trying to encourage everybody to become a race car driver, but what they bring to the table that's unlike, I'm not, I can instruct, I've been around this long enough that I'll help out when I need to, but their experience is such that they can literally sit in the passenger seat with their eyes almost closed and know what someone did wrong. and they just kind of understand it. And I always kind of kid when I first got involved in this. My employees, there were 30 people that wanted to see me climb through the window of a car and go out on a racetrack. And I tried it. And, I don't understand how they can afford to do this, because you go through tires in a day. And God forbid you bang into something. It's a whole different world. But it was a very unique experience. And in one of the drills we train, we call it the emergency lane change. We are teaching people how to stay in control of the car in an emergency. And when I was on the racetrack, I went around, and this is not just a circle track. You're going in and out in different rally type things. And I came around a corner, and I felt the rear of the car sort of slide. And, I felt like I lost a little bit of control for a second. And the person training me was like, listen, next time you come up on that, I want you to be going about 10 miles an hour faster. And I just was like, seriously? And they're like, but as you come into it, tap the brakes. And what that did was it threw all the weight of the vehicle to the front evenly on the wheels before I started to turn. And then when I turned, I had much better control. And that's one of the things we train everybody is you don't really know how you're going to react if a deer comes across the street or something falls off a car. If you need to suddenly aggressively get out of the way of this thing, some people would just steer. But, we don't live in the Midwest. We can't just go off into a field and call somebody, with their tractor to come pull us out. We got guardrails and trees and other cars and all this other stuff. So you really need to get on those brakes first. No matter what you're driving, it is almost 99.9% of the time better for you to just slam on the brakes, even if you come off the brakes pretty quickly, just to get that weight transferred. But oftentimes, just get yourself stopped. Get that weight transferred and then steer yourself to safety. And go from there. So, having those race car drivers is really kind of beneficial from that perspective. But it's a unique thing. And as we grow and see our opportunities to do more things, and we've been asked to do some things outside of New England, we will probably explore, always looking at, race car drivers as the initial folks we want to bring in there. But if we can train people to do the training as well, we're certainly interested in that.
It kind of makes sense now that you mention it, that they might be mostly race car drivers. It hadn't occurred to me until you said that, but those are people who are driving in extreme situations all the time.
And it helps to be a car person. We don't think everybody has to be a car person, but if you're going to drive and you kind of don't take it seriously, you can get yourself into trouble. And so to have people able to answer, questions as we get, again, and it's that world we're in now where there's a lot of people out there who would really like the Google car to come tomorrow because they don't like to drive. And so therefore they get behind the wheel and either they're nervous, which brings its own, concerns, or they're just careless and they just don't think of the ramifications of what could happen because they're not paying attention, because they're updating Facebook or Instagram while they're cruising around, or they're just simply, racing through town to get where they want to go.
So you're teaching not only emergency maneuvers, but you're also teaching the dangers of using technology while you're driving, distractions.
Impairment.
It covers a lot of things.
Yeah, I mean, we're really looking at the most likely crash situations. So, I mentioned impairment. You can have alcohol, you can have drugs in your system. Marijuana use in driving is a big problem right now, and particularly around here. The word is out that it's legal. And it doesn't mean it's legal for young people, but they still think it's okay to do. But the word has not really gotten out that it's unsafe to drive while high. And we've done some different things. You can see on our I think it's on our Facebook account, but we've done some different research studies. We've done some stuff with some of the TV stations where we've had people consume marijuana and then drive. And they joke that they're fine, they drive slower, and maybe one of them drove a little slower, but they all ran into everything we put in front of them. So, I mean, at the end of the day, that message still needs to get out there. And lack of sleep. I mean, again, in this community, not sleeping is the norm.
People don't, especially young people in the schools, when they get to the high school, they start staying up all night to do their homework.
If you have 2 days of that, that little sleep, you're the equivalent of driving around intoxicated in your ability. And, again, I joke to some extent, but if you give me the choice between being on the road with somebody who's high, being on the road with somebody who's drunk, or being on the road with somebody who's actually asleep behind the wheel, I guess I'd take one of the others, because that's a real dangerous position to put people in. So, there's all these different impairments that people can be involved in. And, at the end of the day, as I said before, we're trying to use drama. We don't think every person in every community is going to sign up for this. And we've even had, state legislators, there's a particular law that they're trying to pass to make this, driver's ed actually is not mandatory. So you have to take driver's ed if you want your license before you turn 18. And I mentioned more kids are waiting until 18, but they've talked about, well, maybe we can tie what we do into, you get your license before 18. And it would be nice, but at the end of the day, I mean, we recognize that not everyone will do this voluntarily, but we want to influence those people however we can. And whether that's by doing something so dramatic that their friends talk to them about it and say, you really need to wear your seatbelt. I know you're the passenger, but I don't want you bumping into me when I drive. Or we do programs where with grants and different sponsors, we'll go to a school and we'll drive. They can't drive because it's not a safe environment for them, but we'll do the driving and we'll put them through that slalom I described and try to teach them why they need to have their seatbelts and have them experience what a panic stop feels like and how it, at 10 miles an hour faster, it took that much further to stop. And so therefore you got to leave more room between you and the car in front of you. And just things that are more experiential. We're not taking anything away from driver's ed, but giving them an opportunity to experience things and feel it a little differently than they do in a PowerPoint or a presentation in the classroom.
Okay. I noticed that on your website, too, that you had a section on teaching classes for seniors and how there are some unique situations with seniors. And we only have a few more minutes, but I wanted to ask you about that. I've noticed sort of on my own, I don't know whether I'm right or not, but you can tell me, that occasionally the way seniors decide that they will no longer drive is they have a terrible accident. And they realize I can't anymore. But it takes that terrible accident sometimes to make them stop driving. What kinds of things do you focus on when you customize a class for seniors?
So we have a lot of seniors who just take our standard class. So I'll start by saying our experience has been a parent takes their teen, they come with their teen, and then they go, wow, I need my parents to go through the same class. So that's kind of where it gets us started, and it gives them the opportunity to do it. But when we organize one, with a senior center or something, what we tend to do is it's all the same training at the end of the day, but we come at it a little bit differently. So I won't, bore you with the specifics that make it different, but what you find is reaction time is much slower. Now, seniors tend to drive fewer miles, and so therefore their crash rate is not necessarily as bad as teenagers, because teenagers have this amazing, who's faster than a teenager as far as reaction time?
Sure.
But it doesn't mean that they crash less.
Sure.
But with seniors, you'll tend to find it's a degradation in, their reaction time. It's a stiffness as the body just kind of gets a little bit less fluid and moving, and it does result in people who it's more difficult for them to perform the same drills that many other drivers can do. And we don't report if you fail our course. We actually just tell you to come back. We invite you to, maybe you had a bad day, and it doesn't happen that often. Moreover, with young drivers, when the parents bring them too early, we want to see kids while they still have their permit, but preferably in the month before their road test, not the day after they got their permit and they're still trying to figure out what DNR mean, and that's too early. But with seniors, we'll have that conversation and say, hey, listen, this is what happened today. You're welcome to come back with us, and here's where the areas where you needed to improve. But do you feel comfortable driving to the store now that if a ball rolls out across the street and the kid's there, it took you 5 seconds longer to stop than anybody else in the class? And those are the sorts of things that they just didn't put there. So to your point, they experience the crash. That's why we use these big open spaces. They experience a loss of control that is probably the result of age, and sometimes it's things they can work on. Sometimes it's they weren't paying close enough attention, or there's some muscle thing that they're going to try to address with their doctor. But the reality is, if they're at a point where they weren't able to really pass our class, they shouldn't be on the road. And we've had some really good success with people saying, you know what, I'm glad I did this. I'm not going to drive anymore because I didn't realize it was at that point. And hopefully they pursue some other, whether it's ride from the T or family or Uber. I mean, it's all these things are making it easier for these different Lyft and Uber programs to be a lot more independent, even without a car.
Yeah, Uber would be a much better solution for some people than driving themselves.
Yeah, absolutely.
Certainly.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so if somebody wanted to take a class with your school, how does it work? Is it a single day? Is it more than a day? What does it cost?
So the standard class is a one-time 4.5-hour experience, basically. The way we handle the pricing on it is, it says on our website, if you can afford the $350 it costs us to kind of put it on, we'd love it if you could pay it. But if you can't, there's discounts available. And so we have financial aid for people. Like, unfortunately, there's a lot of families out there who've lost loved ones. So just this week, I got a contact from a mom who wants to take her son through, and they wanted to go together. And I connected them with somebody, and I just have them give me their contact info, and I reach out to the person, and would you be willing to pay for it? And we get it covered that way. So you can kind of go from zero to the $350 mark. And then most of our graduates will get an insurance discount from their insurance company. The biggest insurance companies in the state give between 5 and 10%. Some of them actually pay for the participation. So we try to do a lot of that on our website, but I would encourage people just to contact us with questions, and we're pretty good about getting right back to you to answer things. And if there's a situation, you know, we're always looking for opportunities like this to talk to you, to go to Rotary clubs, to go to PTO functions, just, you know, community. There's organizations. You know, you mentioned you worked for biotech. I'll go into businesses and speak to their employees. You know, a lot of these folks, they're taking driving for granted, and if we can influence them, it's been a you know, as a mission as our organization goes, as a 501c3, we want to spread kind of the gospel that it's better to drive safely, but ultimately it tends to turn into either donations or people who come through the program, or oftentimes companies will buy gift certificates and give them away to different employees and stuff like that. So any opportunity we have to engage with folks is just as worthwhile to me, because it tends to reduce the crash rate there too.
You know, it sounds like you're doing important work, and I hope a few people who watch today will give you a call and take the class themselves. And it sounds like something that ideally pretty much everybody would take at some point.
Once I saw it, I couldn't believe. I mean, again, you know, I will say to folks out there, you're not a good driver. Like, you may think you are. And I'll come into a room full of people and say, how many people think they're a good driver? And then I'll start asking a couple of questions. And usually those same people are getting half of them wrong. And that's it. We just kind of take this for granted. As a society, we are comfortable with this, you know, crashes are a rite of passage. And I'll mention, you've been hearing me use the term crash. I don't call them accidents, because the vast majority, you know, the CDC says like 95% of crashes are avoidable. So they're mostly crashes. Accidents are like, what could I have done?
Sure. Okay, well, thanks for coming in.
Yeah, thank you.
Glad we did this, and as I said, I hope some people give you a call and take the class. I'm thinking about whether I'll do it now.
Love to have you, absolutely.
Well, thanks for coming in, Dan.
Thanks again.
You've been watching In Conversation. Thanks for watching.